The coherence principle focuses on removing clutter from the multimedia lesson. This clutter can come in the form of words, graphics, and audio that ends up disrupting the learning process, clogging the visual and auditory sensory memory channels, and adding to the extraneous cognitive load. When considering asking students to read text, look at visuals, and listen to narration in the multimedia lesson, it is important they solely focus on the primary goal of instruction. The coherence principle can help decide what is clutter in a lesson. How is the learner impacted with extraneous words in a lesson? Well, extra words in a multimedia lesson can interfere with the transfer of learning. Principle 1 of the coherence addresses how e-learning can sometimes be guilty of using too many words, interfering with both the visual and auditory sensory memory channels in the form of visual text or narration of said text. This excess tends to go beyond what is important or relevant to the primary learning goal, thus interfering with the learning process. Adding extra words to a multimedia lesson can interfere with the learning process. We address these three types of extraneous wording. Words used to add interest. These words are related to the topic, but they're not relevant to the primary instructional goal, and they end up overwhelming the cognitive load and decrease coherence. Using seductive details harms learning by distracting learners from the important information by disrupting the coherence of the lesson. On this slide, you can see the two graphics. The one on the left is violating the guidelines by using too many text, thus overwhelming the learner. Where the one on the right, you can see there is minimal use of text, thus helping the cognitive load. The second principle of extraneous use of words can be used when they expand upon key ideas of the lesson. This could be by adding another example to compare or expand upon, which will end up adding more to the cognitive load and distract the learner from what is actually important. In this example, where the graphic's key idea is on what do you do if you encounter a bear, the expand upon violation on the left goes deeper by talking about irrelevant facts about the bear's claws that don't focus on the primary goal of what to do when you encounter a bear. The third principle is by adding technical details that go beyond the key ideas of the lesson. Sometimes subject matter experts who know a lot about their field tend to be the common culprits in this violation, mainly due to their expertise. In these examples here, the violating example on the left, you can see there's a complicated mathematical formula that might be interesting and factual, but ends up unnecessarily overwhelming our learner since it is technical jargon that goes beyond the primary goal of instruction. Principle 2 asks, how do extraneous visuals impact the learner? Well, visuals can be very helpful when they reinforce the primary learning goals. However, anytime an instructional designer includes a visual, they do run the risk of doing more harm than good, specifically when visuals are irrelevant to the main theme of the lesson. When pictures are used only to decorate the page or screen, they are probably not going to improve any learning, and in fact could prohibit it because of the added strain on the visual working memory and increase the cognitive load. Due to the cognitive learning theory, instructors must use graphics that add value and relate directly to the presentation. Otherwise, they run the risk of increasing the cognitive load and disrupting the learning process by using images that only intend to liven up the page or arouse the learner. These arousal images cause the learner to work harder by stealing more of their cognitive energy, attention, and focus. There is further support in a 1998 study that explains in detail how extraneous graphics are harmful because they can lead to distractions that take the learner away from the primary learning goal. They can disrupt the flow of learning, or they can seduce the learner in the wrong direction based on their schema. The visual on the left is an example of a graphic violating these guidelines. The brain diagram on the left has too many details that don't support the primary goal of neural pathways in the brain. Additionally, the realism in the brain can arouse the learner. However, for a simple slide of notes on neural pathways, it may be best to use the simple version on the right. Secondly, when addressing the ketchup and mustard bottles in the two graphics, while the learners can use context clues to figure out what the bottles are on the left, the color version is a bit more simpler and easier to understand without much thought. In the third principle of coherence, we address audio, which can be in the form of narration, sound effects, or music. This has us asking, what happens when the learner is exposed to extraneous audio in a lesson? Extraneous sounds can be in the form of background music or sound effects that coincide while the learner is trying to read text or listen to narration. So the supporting guidelines suggest that when there is narration, leave out the extra sounds. Back to our example on what to do if you encounter a bear. Adding background noises such as bears growling or clawing with other various nature sound effects, these sounds are extraneous and end up proving to be distracting. Moreno and Mayer found evidence that when adding such sounds during a narration will dramatically hurt the learning transfer of knowledge. The coherence principle wrap-up. How is the learner impacted with extra words in a presentation? Well, extra words in a multimedia lesson can interfere with the transfer of learning. Question 2 asks, how do extraneous visuals impact the learner? Including irrelevant and extraneous visuals can disrupt a learner's ability to process essential information. In question 3, what happens when the learner is exposed to extraneous audio in a lesson? Extraneous sounds such as background music or environmental noise can overload working memory. Thank you for listening to the presentation on the coherence principle.